Jim of Shiloh Kahal. My objective today is to, as succinctly as possible, provide an outline, a timeline of that last week of Messiah's life. Before I get started, let me just say that I've been reading for years now from Restored Name Scriptures that tend to try to replace Hebrew, a lot of the Greek references with Hebrew references. So, you'll hear me using different terminology from time to time other than what is really more familiar in our language, English language, as we've predominantly worked from other translations. So forgive me, and I'll try to be mindful of that and present that and point that out as we go through. But let me just say there are some of the basics. Here are some of the basics that I want to provide just because I think it'll come up quite a bit. And the first one I want to provide is Yahudah, Y-A-H-U-D-A-H. Well, that's the same thing as Judea. And for me, Yahudah would be primarily that southern kingdom that would have incorporated the tribes of Judah, the tribes of, or Yehudah, the tribes of Benjamin, some of the tribe of Simeon, and some of the tribe of Levi down there, but historically known as the two tribes to the south, and opposed to what we understood later to be Samaria and the lands of Israel, the lands that the northern kingdom held as the 10 tribes of Israel. So when you hear me say Yehudah, I'll be referencing Judea, what you would normally see in most of our scriptures as Judea, which would be the lands of the Yehudim. It is possible Yehudah might reference a person, but if I was referencing one specific person of Judea, I would say Yehudi. Yehudim would be synonymous with what you're going to read in the scriptures as the Jews, the people of the land of Judea. And for me, the Jews will not just be the ones that we've come to know, those who have rejected Messiah, but the Yehudim, the early church was the Yehudim. We've just lost that identity because it's been absorbed by the concept of church. But Yehudim includes believers and non-believers alike, even though we have come to understand today when we say Jews, we think of non-believers. Then Pesach, the Hebrew, the English word for the Hebrew word, which is Pesach, but we know it more as Passover. But I may go back and forth. It's the same thing, and I'm sorry. Same thing with Matzah, the English word for the Hebrew word, meaning unleavened bread. You might hear me say unleavened bread. You might hear me say Matzah. They are the same thing, and forgive me if that's confusing. So with that, let's get started. What seems good to me before I go to the timeline that I'm going to present, I think it's good to go and revisit what we understand of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I think it's very important to know this because you have to know the construct of it. And at large, the church just doesn't know this. So we are ignorant. We've been ignorant. The church is ignorant that you would have the Passover day, and then the very next day is the first day of unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread specifically, and that's a Sabbath day, and we lose sight of that. That is a midweek Sabbath. Now, most in the church would have seen in their English translations things referencing, say, the high Sabbath, but what they're really just referencing is that midweek Sabbath associated with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Let's go look at the Feast of, the construct of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and let's start with Exodus here. So I don't really want to read you Exodus. I'm going to outline it for you. You would have this Exodus verses 6 through 19 where we get this data. If you're interested, go read it and of course affirm what I'm getting ready to tell you here. But in Exodus 12, as they are getting ready to leave, Exodus 12 is all about the Israelites as they're getting ready to leave Mitzrayim, which is Egypt. They're getting ready to leave. And so they've been instructed, Moses was instructed to tell the people to select and keep a perfect lamb or perfect goat. And I'm not sure if it's in that passage that they gave him the choice of lamb or goat, but let's just say perfect lamb because that's what we're accustomed to. So they were to select that perfect lamb on the 10th day of this first month. and keep it until the 14th day. And then the assembly is to kill it between the evenings on the 14th day. And then they were to place the blood on the doorpost and eat the flesh of it that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread. And that's very key because of what we're going to read in the gospel accounts. And with bitter herbs, with loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in hand, you shall eat it in haste. It's the Pesah of Yahweh. Do not leave any until morning, burn anything left with fire. Yahweh passes through the land of Mitzrayim, smiting the firstborn. This day is to be observed as, Mitzrayim is Egypt again, I'm sorry. This day is to be observed as a festival throughout all generations. So we have the festival, the feast of Pesah, or Passover. First thing. And then we have 7 days where we're to eat unleavened bread. The first of those days is a Kodesh gathering. Now, I don't think I got that from Exodus, and I'm sorry. I may have just inserted that. We're going to get this from Leviticus, and that's where I'm headed there now, because I don't know if they said in Exodus that it was a Sabbath. But they were told to guard the matzah, which is the unleavened bread, the same day I brought you out of your divisions. Now, this matzah, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is to be that next day, because if you think about what they just said, on the 14th day, they're to kill. Well, here, let's just go through. So here is, let's just follow this through. Here's day 1 of the week, which would be, on our calendar, Sunday, but it would have been the 5th day of the month, and we would have carried it through until the 10th day, which would have been day 6 of the week. This is the 10th day of the month, and this is the 6th day of the week. Let me get my pencil. 6th day of the week. And then they were to hold it till the 14th, and then they were to kill it between the evenings, which I suggest is definitely I may build it in this video, but I may make a separate video where I once again explain the construct of a day as I have studied it out and come to believe it works. But we are to kill the Pesah between the evenings, place the blood on the doorpost, eat the Pesah at night. This night on the 14th, we are not to go into the 15th yet. Destroy the remainder of it before morning, and Yahweh passes through the land, destroying the firstborn. All of that occurs on this 14th day of the month, which would have been day 3 of the week. The next day was the day that they were leaving. So when up here it says, guard the matzah the same day I brought you out your divisions out. Well, he didn't bring them out on the 14th, even though we were told to eat unleavened bread. So the first time that the Israelites ate unleavened bread was on the 14th and not the 15th. The 15th is the same day that they were brought out. So that next morning, after they got up, after the angel had gone through the land and killed the firstborn, well, it was the next day that they were leaving, and that would have been the first of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where they were to eat unleavened bread. Now, on this first event, of course, some of this was born out of necessity because they were literally having to eat in haste. They had a lot to do. They had so much going on. As we celebrate year in, year out, well, we're not quite operating in the same haste, even though maybe we should, be mindful of it at the very least. But in their day, they were clearly in haste on the 14th, eating and preparing to go. And on the 15th, they were very busy, and they didn't have time to eat leavened bread. They were eating unleavened bread. Okay, so let's just visit this timeline before I go to Leviticus here. So as I said, the 14th is Pesach, or Passover. That is the day that you are to kill the lamb. You can't kill it on the 13th, and you can't eat it on the 15th. I'm sorry, let me just stay here with, you can't kill it on the 13th, and that is important when we get into the construct of a day. And then we are to eat Pesach at night with unleavened bread. Well, we're to eat it on the 14th at night and not the 15th. We are not to move over to the 15th because the 15th is the first day of unleavened bread. And this is important because on that first day of unleavened bread is a Sabbath where you will have no work except prep work. And then you would have had, as you approached the coming week, you would have had the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the third day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the fourth day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But then you would have also had the weekly Sabbath that would have come up later in the week. So we had a midweek Sabbath that the Yehudim would have called a high Sabbath, and then we would have had a weekly Sabbath approaching a few days later. Let's look at this in Leviticus, where it's just a little bit, this is after they've come out and they're coming into the land. And what is the outline of Leviticus give us for this day? Well, first of all, in Leviticus 23, it says, in the first month, on the 14th day between the evenings is the Pesach to Yahweh. We're to kill between the evenings and eat at night with unleavened bread. So here we are walking through the same timeline here. On the 10th day, which would have been day 6, a Friday, they are to set aside. Israel was to set aside, which now means for us, Israel is to set aside a perfect lamb or goat. And then we're to keep it until the 14th, and then it is to be killed on the 14th. That would be slaughtered. Slaughtered is another word you're going to see in English translation. Slaughtered, killed. It's hard, but that's what happens to the lamb or the goat on that day. That is the day that they are killed. It is killed between the evenings. And then we're not putting blood on doorpost. I don't think. Maybe we should be. I mean, that's something for me to continue to study. But we're to eat Pesach at night with unleavened bread, destroying the remainder before morning. So this is the command according to Leviticus. We are to kill the Pesach on the 14th, not the 13th. And we're to eat it that night with unleavened bread. So here's the first of our unleavened bread meals, even though we have not yet reached the Feast of Unleavened Bread. All of this is still on the 14th, so we're having our Pesach meal, our Passover meal with unleavened bread on the 14th at night, the day before the 15th. Because when the 15th comes, the next day comes, we begin the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a 7-day feast, a separate feast. This is the Feast of Pesach, the Feast of Passover, and this is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, a separate feast. And we even named it the Unleavened Bread, but it's a 7-day feast. And the first day is to be a Sabbath unto us. In fact, let me just go up here and finish this. In Leviticus 23, on the 15th day of this month is the festival of Matzah, or unleavened bread, to Yahweh. 7 days, eat unleavened bread. So this would be, you add this day to this day, we have 8 days of eating unleavened bread. That's been confusing to a lot of people, because when the time comes in the gospel accounts, the first day of unleavened bread, but the first day of unleavened bread is not the same thing as the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. The first day of unleavened bread is Passover. Okay, and the first day, according to the instructions of Leviticus, is to be a Sabbath day with no servile work, only food preparation, and the 7th day is to be a Sabbath with no servile work, only food preparation. So, this is all very important, because here is what we would call the high, well, in many of the English scriptures would have called the high Sabbath, but it's really just a midweek Sabbath associated with the appointed times, the Moedim, M-O-E-D-I-M, Moedim, appointed times, the Feast of Yahuwah. So here is that Sabbath that we observe, which would be on day 4 of the week, and then we would have the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the third day of Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then the 4th day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But that also then is our weekly Sabbath, that I think, and I'm going to hold to, is what we're reading in the Greek as on one of the Sabbaths. When they say on one of the Sabbaths, they are talking about the weekly Sabbath, one of the weekly Sabbaths. I think that's what they're commonly referencing here. And then just to finish it out, we have, what would that be? The day 5 of unleavened bread, 6 of unleavened bread, and then the 7th day of unleavened bread, we're to eat unleavened bread until evening. Also Sabbath, no servile work, and we're supposed to have a Kodesh gathering, which is a gathering, a separate gathering, which we're supposed to have on the first day as well. A kahal, that's Q-A-H-A-L, kahal, assembly. We're all to gather. So we're having a meeting. I mean, that's really, if the church was trying to honor Yahuwah, which is, you're going to hear me say Yahuwah for Jesus, Yahuwah. If the church is trying to honor Yahuwah, one of the ways to do that would be to keep the Sabbath, because that's what he was honoring. You know, he was honoring the Torah, honoring the commands. He was honoring Leviticus 23. So we should keep that Sabbath. We should have these Kodesh meetings. We should be keeping this Feast of Pesach, which I know is foreign to us here in our lands. And so it's a steep learning curve for us to try to figure out how to keep Pesach in a reasonable manner. But it's now become an objective of ours. Okay, so this is the outline. Keep this in mind. We have to keep this in mind when we go to the events of Messiah, that last week of Messiah's death. But this would be a good time, I think, to introduce that this time frame, this day 3 being the 14th and day 4 being the 15th, in the calendar system of the Zadoks. And who are the Zadoks? The Zadok was the remaining lineage from the days of Solomon forward all the way through to 175 BC, the sons of Zadok, who are the lineage of Aaron, the only rightful high priest and the leadership of the temple. They were keeping the calendar as was given to Israel, and they were keeping it forever and they were keeping it right up to Onias III. I hope to do a video where I'm going to explain a little bit about what happened to Onias III, who was the last of the legitimate Zadokite priests. His brother Jason usurped him with the help of Antiochus Epiphanes in 175 BC. And while Jason might have been a Zadokite of the Zadokite lineage, he was the first of the Hellenistic priests. He was a sympathizer with Greece and the idea of Hellenizing the Yehudim. And so with his rise and, replacing Onias as that high priest in that moment, well, that's when Onias, who pushed back against the Greek calendar systems, that really I need to do this, make the video, because you can read in 2nd Maccabees where Jason just absolutely went about the business of Hellenizing, which was a goal of Antiochus. So they were trying to make the law of the land, the rule of the land of Yehuda as well. And Jason helped with that. So with the coming of Jason came the sweeping away of the calendar of the Zadokites, the calendar of Israel, replacing it with the calendar that was being operated by Greece in the time. Now, Greece has had many calendars. But I'm confident, it makes sense when I will show you in a different video how we end up at 175 BC. We see the advent of the coming of the calendar system, that the Yehudim, the mainstream Yehuda, because basically with the coming of Jason and then the remaining Hellenist priests and then the Maccabees. The Maccabees, even though they didn't actually conquer Greece, but even though they wrested control back, lots of control, not full control, back in the land, they never really went back to returning the high priesthood to the Zadokites and returning to the ways of the Zadokites. This is when we were having the rise of the Pharisees, the oral traditions, all kinds of things where error became rampant. Not that Israel hasn't always been in error keeping Torah, even under the leadership of Zadok, the Zadok priest, but the Zadokian priest, but especially under, the Hellenistic priests and then the Maccabean priests, which would be the Hasmonean priests. We had rampant growth and the assumption of a calendar. And you're going to see that, Yahushua kept an entirely different calendar than what they did in, what the mainstream Yehudim were keeping in the land of Yehuda. Okay. So let me also say, if I can, that in the Zadok calendar that has become very evident because of the findings of what they found in Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which would have been the lands of Bethabar, which I contend would have been the stronghold of the Zadokite priesthood that existed during the days of John the Baptist and Yahushua, and would have been the affirmed priesthood, because in the actual temple was the illegitimate priesthood. The temple had become, and the temple services had become spoiled. The temple priesthood had become illegitimate. The true priesthood and the real effort to keep the Torah and the ways of Torah were found amongst the Zadokite priests that had been exiled, kicked out of the temple and now had coalesced in, I think, Bethabara, which became known as Qumran. Then the compounds that you would see there and the systems that you would see there with the baptismals, that's where John the Baptist went in the wilderness. That's who Yahushua went to for his anointing, his baptism. He didn't go to the temple priest. He went to John the Baptist out in this compound, in this area, this grouping of people. And we know from the writings that were getting out of the Dead Sea Scrolls that they were keeping the calendar system of the Zadoks. And the calendar system of the Zadoks it was based on the calendar system of Enoch, as we would read in First Enoch. And in the calendar system of the Zadoks, it's a 364-day calendar. And every year on day 3 will be the 14th. Every year on day 4 will be the 15th, and it will not vary. So this is why we know when we get to the timeline of Messiah that Yahushua, when they do the preparation and the Passover, it would have been the 14th, but it also would have been day 3 of the week, because that's how the Zadok calendar worked. And that is not how the calendar that the Yehudim were keeping was worked. The Yehudim and even the calendars that the Jews keep today are not consistent on which day these Moedim will be, which was the whole purpose of, well, I shouldn't say that it's the whole purpose, but that was part of the pushback from Onias and the Zadokites against on Greece, and they just needed to keep the calendar because that's how they would honor and observe the feast according to Torah. Okay. So what I'm saying here is that, and let me just go back to my quick outline and just point out my point is that Yahushua or Jesus and the mainstream Yehuda, which would have been Judea. So Yahushua, Jesus, and mainstream Judea were working on different calendars. So that means that Yahushua and his Talmidim and the Zadoks would have been working on a calendar, and mainstream Yehuda, which would have been the Yehudim or the Jews, and the Pharisees were all working on a different calendar with a different day that you're going to see lands them a day behind how Yahushua observed Passover. And then as I finish up here, the account as given to us in the Greek is correct and matches what we're going to find in the timeline of Yahushua's last week of his life. It will not, what we see in the underlying Greek to our, the various versions that are being translated for us and given us, not just in English, I think throughout the whole world, how they are pointing us to a first day of the week being the resurrection day, because that's church doctrine. But they are doing violence to the original Greek to get there. When you go and consider the Greek as it is written to us, it is in perfect harmony with the timeline that I'm getting ready to give you based upon that last week of Yahushua's life. So let's get started. Okay, let me explain to you what I did, and I don't want to spend time on it because it just would make this video too long. But I went through each of the Gospels, and I just went through chapter by chapter and just outlined any information they gave us related to what was happening, not just the week of his death, but in the week prior as well, so I could develop a timeline and work them together, correlate them. And so this is what I came up with out of Messiah. Then I did it for Mark. I'm sorry, did I say Messiah? I meant to say Matthew, but here I did it with Mark. And Mark gives us a lot of good time, a lot of good timing in this. There's his outline, and then here is Luke's outline, and in the events of his that he provides us, and then here's John. So I took all of these events and I combined them, correlated to come up with the timeline, the final timeline that I'm working from and going to present to you here. So here it is in summary fashion. So on the 14th day of the week, which would have been, let me get my pencil here and make sure. So on the 14th day of the month, we've been holding the Pesach or the Passover, lamb or goat since the 10th. And you're to prepare it then between the evenings on the 14th. So, in the gospel accounts, they will say, as the first day of unleavened bread, or on the first day of unleavened bread, or as the first day of unleavened bread approached. Well, what is the first day of unleavened bread? It's not the feast of unleavened bread. Even though, the feast of unleavened bread does involve, as a festival, as a Moedim, does involve a keeping of unleavened bread. It's not the first day that they were eating unleavened bread. So on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Messiah and said, how do you want us to prepare? And he sent them off with instructions, and they did. They went and they prepared. And that you will know from differing accounts that they had to slaughter and kill the lamb on that day between the evenings, between morning and night, between the sun coming up and the sun going down. They had to kill and prepare the Pesach meal, which is exactly what they did. And when the time came, according to one of the gospel accounts, which was evening or night, Messiah came with the rest of his disciples, and they sat down to eat that Pesach meal, that Passover meal. So we know, according to the calendar Yahushua was keeping, on day 3 of that week would have been the 14th, because this is the day that they're killing and preparing the Pesach. They're eating that Pesach meal that night. And then after they ate the Pesach meal is when they left the upper room and went out to the Mount of Olives, where the Garden of Gethsemane was. While they were out there in the middle of the night is when the soldiers came with Yehuda, leading them to arrest him and take him away. And then we have the events as they're taken away off to the Kohen Haggadah, which would be the high priest. Kohen is priest, Haggadah is the high priest. And the scribes and the Pharisees and the other leaders. By the way, when I'm saying Talmidim, that's disciples. If I might say disciples, I might say Talmidim interchangeably, but they're the same thing. Talmidim. I'll probably say Talmidim more than disciples. Okay. So Yahushua was taken off to the Kohen Haggadah, and we see all the events that took place there, with some mocking and just the things that took place in front of the high priest. And then as they're leading him away from the high priest and to Pilate, the cock crows. And we know now morning has come, because the cock is crowing. So all of the events, the preparation day was the day before, eating the Pesach meal was in the evening, moving into the night of the day before, the day, on the 14th. Then on the 14th, they continued to meet out and we're meeting out in the Mount of Olives. That's where he was arrested. That's when, on the 14th still, that he was meeting with the Israelites, the leaders of Israel, or the leaders of the Yehudim. And then as they're leading him out, the cock crows. So that ends the 14th, because the 15th is coming on. I hope to do a follow-up video as to why I have, because of the work I've done and the research I've done, I've come to believe and think that, and this would be one more evidence as we watch the events of this Passover week, why I think the days are accounted from morning, the rising of the sun, through the night to the rising of the sun again. That's what makes the day. So really, with the rising of the sun, we are getting to the 15th. And when we get to the 15th, we get the first day of unleavened bread. And what is that day? According to Leviticus, it's the Sabbath. So we have a Sabbath day in the middle of the week, according to the calendar that Yahushua and his Talmidim would have been keeping. So we're on a Sabbath. But in the morning at around 6 a.m., and we know 6 a.m. we think 6 a.m. anyway, because John says the 6th hour. Well, that wouldn't work on the accounting that we see throughout the rest of them. And I think even later he says that he dies on the 9th hour. Wouldn't make sense. But we had the Roman calendar that we were dealing with. We had the calendar that the mainstream Yehudim would have been dealing with. And we would have had the calendar that Yahushua and his Talmidim were keeping. But I think it's pretty evident that around 6 a.m., as the sun is coming up, and what is John is calling the 6th hour in that moment, is when he's brought before Pilate. It was a little later, the third hour, around 9 a.m., that he was literally impaled. So all the events of Pilate, what took place before Pilate, and when he was led off to, which king was it of Judea? Anyways, he was brought back. All those events was all took place between 6 a.m.-ish, morning and about the third hour, which had been 9 a.m., because it was about the third hour that he was crucified and impaled. And then he hung on the cross for about 3 hours, and then in the sixth hour, darkness came on the land. That would have been around noon. And for 3 hours to the ninth hour, darkness stayed on the land. At around the ninth hour, he yells out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And then he yells out again, and then he breathes his last and gives up his spirit, depending upon what gospel account you're reading. So then that night, then he's taken down from the cross, and he spends his first night in Sheol. As evening is approaching, Joseph of Arimathea comes and negotiates for his body, takes his body down and sets him in a tomb. Okay. For Messiah, staying with Messiah, he would have been that would have been his first night in Sheol. Then the second day of unleavened bread on the 16th would have been his first day in Sheol, and the second night in Sheol. The third day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread would have been his second day in Sheol. Sheol, by the way, is the belly of the earth. It's what we would know today as, well, heaven, purgatory, all the ways that we might talk about it. It's the place where souls go as they are awaiting the resurrection. Upon dying, their spirit goes to Sheol to await the resurrection. Okay, so that would have been his second day in Sheol, and then that night would have been his third night in Sheol. And then according to the gospel accounts, according to Mark, according to all of the gospel accounts, we have now reached one of the Sabbaths, because the next day, which would have been the fourth day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the calendar Messiah was keeping, it would have also been that weekly Sabbath. And this is referenced as one of the Sabbaths, or if you're going to do it in correct Greek grammar, you have to say one of the Sabbath days. I'm not going to explain that here. I've done it elsewhere. But Mark 16:9 tells us that after having risen first thing on the Sabbath, or the Sabbath day, risen first thing on the Sabbath, then came Miriam and Miriam, showing up early to the tomb to find him gone. Later in the day, we find that he appeared. Well, he appeared first to Miriam of Magdala, Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdala. Is that how we say it in the English translations? But her first, and then to his talmidim. He showed up later in that same day to him. To them at dinner. That's the same day that he walked with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. So all of these events are happening on this weekly Sabbath, on one of the Shabbatot, as given to us in the Greek text, the Greek writings. Okay. All right, but let's go back and look at how this week was for the mainstream Yehuda, as is identified for us. Because remember that Yahushua they did all their preparation day. They've already eaten their Pisah meal. They've eaten it. By the time he's arrested, he has eaten his Passover meal. So they've already observed Passover. But here we are on the same day that all of these events are occurring, and that he's being crucified on his Sabbath, on the Sabbath day, the first day of the unleavened bread. Well, on that same day, it's being identified for us in the various gospel accounts that the mainstream Yehuda, this was their preparation day. Yes, the day prior was the preparation day of the Talmidim and Yahushua, but today is their preparation day, which would have made it the 14th. So on their calendar, this had to be the 14th. Even though on Yahushua's calendar it had to be the 15th, it must be the 14th on their calendar. So their calendar is lagging in that year a day behind the calendar of the Zadoks, the calendar that Yahushua would have been keeping. And it's identified for us that they didn't go in, according to John, they didn't want to go into the palace because they didn't want to ruin their ability to eat Passover. So Yahushua had already eaten Passover. Now they're talking about not losing the ability to eat Passover later in that day. And later, as Joseph of Arimathea is trying to take down his body, we know that it's given to us in the gospel accounts that the Sabbath is approaching. According to the calendar that Messiah is on, they're already in the Sabbath. But according to the calendar that the Yehudim were keeping, the mainstream calendar, the Sabbath was still approaching. And then when we have the account, that the women, because they didn't go buy spices, the women, Miriam and Miriam and the other women watched during the when all of these events were happening, they were watching, and they watched where Joseph and Nicodemus placed Yahushua's body and prepared. But the next day they did not go to buy the spices they need or prepare the spices. They rested on the Sabbath according to the command. Well, if they were observing what Yahushua, the calendar Yahushua would have been keeping, they would have already also had the first of those Sabbath days. But then they had to deal with the mainstream Sabbath because all the shops were closed. There was no transacting of business on that day. And there would have been pressure to keep the Sabbath, to rest on that day, to not do things on that day, because that's what mainstream Yehuda would have been doing on that next day, which would have been day 5 of that week. It would have been the Thursday. It would have been the 16th on Messiah's calendar, but the 15th on their calendar. But the women rested that day. So then, on the next day, which would have been day 6, which would have been the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread for the mainstream Yehudim, it ends the Sabbath, and so Mary and Mary could go out and buy the spices that they needed to anoint Israel. So they went and bought and prepared the spices, and the next day showed up early, as it was dim, as the light was coming up, as they were very early in the day. But they were still too late to get there before Messiah arose, because he was gone by the time they got there. But it also appears that he had just arisen, because we've got the stone had been rolled away, the angel, or 2 angels, depending upon which account you are reading, is there and explaining that the person you're looking for is not here. He's risen as he said he would. So that appears to have just happened. And when they turn around on one of the accounts, Mary sees Yahushua right there. So it appears that he had just risen when they're showing up. That's what it appears. But according for the mainstream Yehuda, actually the Yehudim probably weren't. I've put this under their account here because I've got the Yehudim down lower here. But I don't know that it belongs there, because I don't know that it really belongs with the Yehudim. They aren't the one really trying to say that he rose on the 3rd day. What we understand is the Jews today would say he didn't rise at all. I mean, that's what they would say, that he's not even the Messiah. But the church says he's the Messiah, but they're also trying to say that on this first day, which is Sunday, is when he rose and they give us the resurrection. All of the accounts give us this day as a resurrection day. All of the translations that the church has and is working from. Okay, so basically in all the translations, they're going to say on the first day of the week was he resurrected, according to Mark 16:9, and according to Matthew 28:1 and Mark 16:2, and Luke 24:1, and I think it's John 21. In all of those accounts, they've got Mary and Martha coming to the tomb on this day, the first day of the week, to find him resurrected. Okay. Which I just think is errant, because he had risen on one of the Sabbaths on the 7th day of the week. Okay, so let's go visit each of these passages so that I can explain why I'm coming to the conclusions that I'm coming to. Now, here we're going to start with Matthew 28:1, and almost all of the English translations are going to read something like this: after the Sabbath, it being dawn toward the first day of the week. They'll all say something like that. And you're not going to be able to go from a paraphrased version like the NIV and fix it by going to a more literal translation like the King James, or there is nowhere for you to go in the translations and get what I'm getting ready to tell you, because they're all going to tell you that this Mian Sabbaton means the first day of the week. They're all going to tell you that, but that's not literally what the Greek is saying. What is the Greek saying? Here's what the Greek is saying. After the Sabbaton, this is the plural word for Sabbath. Here it is in Greek, and here's the transliterated Greek. Being dawn, or toward the one, and what this is toward, one of the Sabbath. One of the Sabbaths, because this is plural also. So let me just rephrase that again. After the Sabbaths, toward, or being dawn toward one of the Sabbaths. That's literally what the Greek says. Literally. And let's go visit my timeline and test that. So what we're saying, After the Sabbaths. Why is it plural? Now I know the English translations are having trouble with that because they think there's only one Sabbath. And a lot of times they're actually trying to go all the way back to the prior week Sabbath. Knowing that they've got this weekly Sabbath, they want to go all the way back to the prior week Sabbath because they forget that they've got a midweek Sabbath for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And I would say most of the church would understand it that way without having done a little work to find out what was involved in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But most of the translators understand it differently. But they don't think of it as they know that there was a Sabbath in the middle of the week, but they're struggling to embrace that there were two Sabbaths in the middle of the week. Why would Matthew 28 say Sabbaths? Why? Well, I think that can be easily explained because we have this first Sabbath that Yahushua would have been keeping. And the writer of Matthew would have known that he would have been having to keep. He just ate the Passover. So he knew this was the Sabbath day for those, who are following Yahushua, members of the Talmudim. But he also knew that this 15th was also the 14th day, and that the next day was going to be the Sabbath as celebrated by mainstream Yehuda. So we had two Sabbaths in the midst of that week. So when he says after the Sabbaths, he's technically and legitimately correct in that there were two Sabbaths in that week, as clearly evidenced by the keeping of two different Passover days, and then as on one of the Sabbaths. So, and if you do this timeline in the 3 days, it gets you to one of the Sabbaths. If this is when he ate Passover and this is when he died, this is the third day, and he had to be risen on the Sabbath. If this timeline is true, if you wait till Sunday, you're on the fourth day. It cannot work. So technically, then, Matthew is 100% correct when he says after the Sabbath toward dawn on one of the Sabbaths. He's technically correct. Let's go look at Mark 2, which would be the next account. And it reads like this, and all of the translations will read something like, and very early on the first day of the week, they come to the tomb. It would be something like that. So basically, they, being Mary and Mary, they came to the tomb, having arisen the sun. So the sun came up, and they came to the tomb. And this is pretty much what all of your translations are going to say. But what does the Greek say? Well, here's sabbaton, plural again. So here's how it reads. It's, I'm not going to try to read all of this. I guess I will. Kai, lien, proi, early. T, mia, one of the Sabbaths. So early, very early on one of the Sabbaths. That's how it literally reads. Now we know because of the work of the Greek scholars will tell us, well, you've got a feminine adjective modifying a neuter noun and you can't have it. So we have to insert days. So we know technically this would be an ellipsis where it should read one of the Sabbath days, but it's shortened to Sabbaths. Just like we can do it in English, it appears they were doing that in Greek as well. To explain all of that, I did create a video where I was addressing, I had the honor of somebody who I believe is a Greek scholar challenging this concept of timiaton sabbaton, meaning one of the Sabbaths, and why it can't work. So he starts introducing the grammar to the situation, idioms, ellipsis. So there's information that I had to test and try. It was a wonderful, difficult, but a wonderful learning curve for me and experience. Well, all of that is now contained in a video that I called Miaton Sabbaton, Testing the Perspective of a Greek Scholar. Came out around 3/19 of 2026. Now this is nearly a 3-hour video, but that is pared down. Every time I tried to make it, it kept growing, and it got up to 4.5 hours, and I just had to find ways to pare it down. I did try to create some, cut to the chase ones where I made a 45-minute video trying to summarize this without building the case for it all. I did the same thing, a why does it matter video, trying to summarize, trying to keep the video shorter. But anyways, here's where I developed the case for what I'm telling you now in this video. So literally, it says, and very early on one of the Sabbaths, they came to the tomb. So Mark is telling us it's on one of the Sabbaths. Let's go look at Mark 16:9. Okay, and how does it read? Having risen, this is how. Now this is a difficult read. In fact, give me a second. Let me go look it up real quick. And forgive me, I didn't mean to say it's a difficult read. It's just, it's a different read, because here's what pretty much all of the versions are saying. All of your translations are going to say, having risen, Yahushua, Jesus, having risen now early the first day of the week. And this is what they're telling you, first day of the week. He appeared first to Mary of Magdala, which would be Mary Magdalene, to whom he had cast out the 7 days. But having risen now early the first day of the week. But what does the Greek literally say? Early, anastas, like having risen, now, proi, early, and then proti. What is this? This is the literal word for first. So literally, the writer meant first here, but he also meant something more like foremost, first thing. Because what did he write? Proti, first Sabbath too. So he didn't say first day of the week, he said first Sabbath. So having risen first Sabbath too, literally, having risen early first Sabbath too. And this is singular. Here's Sabbath too, singular. That's what he wrote. Having risen first Sabbath too. Now first, I believe, is still feminine. It so means that we have to put the ellipsis in there, day. So it would read and should read, to get correct Greek grammar, it should say having risen now early first thing on the Sabbath day, in which case we would, need to have an ellipsis for on the. We would put we would have had to insert our definite article here of the, and then our feminine noun here, Sabbath day. But literally what Mark wrote in 16:9 is having risen now early first thing on the Sabbath day. That's what Mark told us in 16:9. So in 16:2, he just said they came early on one of the Sabbaths. And here in 16:9, he tells us that he, Yahushua, having risen now the early, first thing on the Sabbath, foremost thing on the Sabbath. Let's go look at the Luke version for this. So it's basically the same thing played out over and over again. All of your scriptures, all of your translations are going to read something like, however, the first day of the week dawned very early, they came to the tomb. Something like that. But what does Luke 24 really say in the Greek? However, if you want D to be however, first on the Sabbath. So that's, one of the Sabbath days. That's literally, one of the Sabbaton, one of the Sabbaths. That's what's literally written. However, let's just say on one of the Sabbaths, dawn very early. So what Luke really wrote is on one of the Sabbaths. And if you want to correct it, it'd be one of the Sabbath days. But that's literally what he wrote. He did not write first day of the week. He wrote on one of the Sabbaths. So Luke 24 is telling us one of the Sabbaths. So let's go look at John 21. It's the same thing played out. Now the first, all of the translations are going to read something like now the first day of the week. But what does the Greek say? TD miaton sabbaton, on one of the Sabbaths again. So literally it's telling us one of the Sabbaths, not the first day of the week. On one of the Sabbaths, Mary Magdalene comes early while it's still dark to the tomb. Okay, and then what does John 20:19 tell us? John 20:19 is dealing with, all of our versions are going to say, therefore evening on the same day, the first day of the week. So basically the essence of this passage is it's that same day that he had risen and that Mary had gone to the tomb. Later in that very same day, well, all of your translations are going to just make sure it's the first day of the week, but that's not what the Greek says, because it's really, therefore evening, the same day, here's day, and the same of the one of the Sabbaths, because that's really, here we go, Sabbaton again. So early, same day on one of the Sabbaths. We're needing to supply the definite article of the, and we're going to have to supply the feminine noun day, which would be literally What he literally wrote was on one of the Sabbaths, but to be correct, it would be one of the Sabbath days. But still, he's not writing first day of the week. He's writing on the Sabbath. So every one of the accounts that we have in the Greek is telling us that the events occurred on the Sabbath day, on one of the weekly Sabbaths, to be differentiated from from the Sabbath and maybe the Sabbaths, both of them, because we had the Sabbath that Yahushua would have kept, the Zadokites would have kept, and that the mainstream Yehuda would have kept. So we would have had 2 midweek Sabbaths, and then the following Sabbath, that weekly Sabbath, well, that's the day that all the events occurred. And that's what's being evidenced for us by these passages in Greek. All right. In closing, I want to visit one more time and just outline as quickly as I can the events of the day. So on the 14th, we know that the Passover has to be celebrated on the 14th. The Passover has to be slaughtered and killed and prepared on the preparation day, which would be during the daylight hours of the 14th, and then they are to eat the Pesach meal at night, which is exactly what Yahushua did. And this would have been on day 3 of that week. And then later in that night, we have, after they left the meal and went out into the Mount of Olives, this is where he was arrested and taken to the leaders of the Yehudim. The next day, he was brought to Pilate. After about 3 hours in front of Pilate, he was impaled or crucified around 9 a.m. Around 3 hours later, 3 hours into his crucifixion, it becomes dark around noon, and it stays dark until about 3, the 9th hour, at which time he yells out and then gives up and dies, basically, and enters into Sheol. And then he has his first day in Sheol and second night in Sheol. Then he had the second day in Sheol on the Friday, on day 6, and the third night in Sheol. And then he rises early, first thing on one of the Sabbaths. And then Mary show up also early, but too late. He's already risen because he rose first thing on the Sabbath. And they found him gone. And he appeared first to Mary of Magdala. And then later in the day, that same day, according to Acts 20, verse 19, he made himself known to his Talmidim, showed up in that room where he entered through the wall and spoke to them. And he had already had his conversation on the road to Emmaus with his 2 disciples. So he appeared to his disciples all on that Sabbath day. Okay, there is more I want to cover, but I've decided I'm going to try to do that through different videos, and I'm going to put it all in a playlist, in my resurrection playlist, though, because there are things I would like to discuss associated with this. Why are there 2 calendars? Why is there one calendar that Yahushua is keeping and an entirely different calendar that the Yehudim is keeping, that mainstream Yehuda was keeping? Well, there's a very good reason, but it's going to take a little time to substantiate that. And then, I do want to revisit the day. I've spent a lot of time on the construct of a day and testing it out. And I want to explain and show why, because so many are trying to evaluate this week according to an evening to evening timeline that they've received from the Yehudim, the Judaism, today's Judaism, where they're keeping an evening to evening day. And so the church is trying to follow their lead. Whenever they start trying to figure out a Sabbath, they start working from an evening to evening day. And then even the Torah communities, who really are starting to embrace so much of what we need to be embracing as Israel, but they are confused by the leadership of Judaism, and they are following them into this evening to evening construct of a day, which makes all of this work. If you try to employ an evening to evening construct in this timeline, it all falls apart. It becomes very difficult to do. I've watched people, I've tried to follow people, I've tried to do it myself many, many times, and it just doesn't work. And so I want to make a case for that. So that'll be a different video too. All right. Well, please, if you find value in what I'm doing, please like and share as you would. And may you be Baruch.